It started in South Dakota, a farm boy with conflicting birth records, a teenage mechanic, then a soldier who fought on the Mexican border and in the trenches of France. He came home with medals, scars, and a reputation for courage. Within 15 years, that same man would be accused of leading one of the most infamous massacres in American history. Federal agents would be dead, a nationwide manhunt would follow, and his own life would end in a ditch outside Detroit, beaten and strangled by men who once called him an ally. This is the story of Verne Miller, a sheriff who became an outlaw, and the choices that turned a war hero into a hunted man. It begins with uncertainty. The official records do not agree on when Verne Miller was born. Some documents list August 25th, 1892. Others say 1895. Still others 1896. Even the place shifts depending on the source. Kimball, South Dakota. Interior, South Dakota. Illinois. Iowa. The paper trail never settles on one version. From the start, the facts blur. What is consistent is this. He grew up in South Dakota. His parents divorced while he was still a boy, leaving him largely on his own. By the age of 10, he had dropped out of school. Childhood ended early for him. There was no long education, no steady supervision, no protection from hard realities. The documents suggest independence came before maturity. In 1914, still a teenager, Miller moved roughly 35 miles northeast to Huron, South Dakota. Huron was a working town, steady and practical, and Miller found work as an auto mechanic. It was skilled labor for a young man without formal schooling. He learned engines, tools, machinery. It was honest work, and by all accounts, he handled it well. At this point in his life, there was nothing in the public record to suggest the direction he would eventually take. No violent arrests, no criminal indictments, no scandal. He was a young man making his way in a Midwestern town, building a reputation with his hands and his discipline. The contradictions in his birth records remain unresolved. There is no verifiable explanation for the discrepancies. Whether they were clerical errors or deliberate obfuscations is unknown. What is clear is that by 1914, Verne Miller had begun constructing an identity for himself in Huron, one built on work, resilience, and a quiet intensity that would follow him into the next chapter of his life. In 1916, with Europe already at war and tension rising along the southern border, Verne Miller enlisted in the United States Army. He was still a young man from Huron, a mechanic with limited schooling, but the military offered structure and purpose. That year, he was deployed to the Mexican border as part of the Pancho Villa Expedition, the U.S. response to cross-border raids that had shaken the Southwest. It was a harsh assignment, defined by heat, dust, and long patrols. For Miller, it was the beginning of a life shaped by weapons and discipline. In the spring of 1917, he briefly returned to Huron. During that short window home, he married Mildred. The timing mattered. Within a month, he was recalled to active service as the United States entered the First World War. Whatever future he imagined in South Dakota was put on hold. On April 17, 1918, Miller landed in France with the American Expeditionary Forces. He served with the 18th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division, one of the first American units to see sustained combat on the Western Front. The fighting was relentless. Trench warfare demanded endurance and nerve, and Miller proved he had both. He was wounded twice. At some point during his service, he suffered lung damage from exposure to poison gas, an injury that would follow him long after the war ended. Despite those setbacks, his record in combat stood out. He was recognized as a skilled marksman and sniper. The French government awarded him the Croix de Guerre for bravery under enemy fire. It was a decoration reserved for soldiers who demonstrated courage in the face of direct combat. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, Miller had risen to the rank of color sergeant. It was a position of responsibility and trust, entrusted with carrying the unit's colors and maintaining order under fire. He returned home not as a mechanic, but as a decorated war hero. The transformation was significant. In Huron, his service elevated him. Newspapers praised his record. He came back with medals, scars, and the kind of reputation that opened doors in a small Midwestern town. What the records cannot fully capture is how the war shaped him internally. Combat hardens some men. It unsettles others. In Miller's case, the discipline and skill he learned overseas would later reappear in ways no one in Huron could have predicted. When Verne Miller returned to Huron after the war, he carried more than medals. He carried a reputation. In a small South Dakota town, a decorated veteran commanded respect, and it did not take long for Miller to move into law enforcement. Soon after his discharge, he joined the Huron Police Department as a patrolman. The local newspaper welcomed him with confidence. An editor warned that lawbreakers had better watch out if they wanted to keep their health. Miller approached the job with intensity. Less than 3 months into his service, he arrested W.S. Davis, a member of a prominent Huron family, for blocking traffic with his car. Davis protested loudly, arguing his status in town. Miller did not bend. Davis spent the night in jail. It was a message that Miller did not intend to grant favors. His courage became more visible during a volatile incident at a local theater. M.B. Balsiger, the theater manager, had knocked unconscious a popular war veteran and speaker, R.E. Beckwith, during a dispute over payment. News spread quickly. A crowd formed outside the theater, angry and emotional, still raw from the war years. The building was splashed with yellow paint. The mob demanded Balsiger be handed over. Balsiger turned to Officer Miller for protection. Miller ordered the crowd to disperse. They refused. As he escorted Balsiger toward the police station, a brick struck the manager in the head. Miller drew his pistol and advanced on the mob. The show of force broke the crowd's momentum. The rioters dispersed and Balsiger survived the night. It was a moment that reinforced Miller's image as fearless and perhaps reckless. Stories circulated that he was quick with his weapon. Some claimed that while serving as a city officer, he had fired at tourists for traffic violations. After he was elected sheriff, county commissioners formally warned him about the legal consequences of an over-eager trigger finger. Even before that election, the reputation was forming. Miller did not hesitate when he believed action was required. By May 1920, tensions inside the department surfaced. Miller resigned from the Huron Police Department, citing fundamental disagreements with Police Chief Johnson over how police business should be conducted. The split marked the end of his short but intense tenure as a patrolman. He was no longer simply a war hero adapting to civilian life. He was becoming a figure of authority in Huron, admired by some, viewed with caution by others. The discipline and aggression that had served him in France were now shaping his approach to law enforcement on the streets of South Dakota. In November 1920, only months after resigning from the Huron Police Department, Verne Miller stood for election as sheriff of Beadle County. The campaign was contentious. Rumors circulated about his temperament and his past, yet his status as a decorated war veteran carried weight. When the ballots were counted, he won by a margin of 41 votes. It was narrow, but it was decisive. At 20-something years old, Miller became the chief law enforcement officer of the county. He leaned into the role with visible energy. He helped found the Huron Post of the American Legion and served as its delegate to the state convention. He was seen as a community leader, a veteran who had returned home to protect his town. Prohibition was in full effect, and Miller took that mandate seriously. During his first 6 months in office, records show he located and destroyed 9 moonshine stills. So much illegal liquor was confiscated that he reportedly used it as antifreeze in the radiators of sheriff's department vehicles. It was a detail that locals remembered. It spoke to both his aggressiveness and his practicality. His reputation for using firearms followed him into the sheriff's office. Stories from his time as a patrolman lingered, including accounts that he had fired at traffic violators. The county commission formally warned him about the legal consequences of an over-eager trigger finger. Even so, the reputation had its effect. In one instance, a prison escapee hiding in a pasture surrendered after hearing what he believed were gunshots. He later told a reporter that he thought Verne Miller was on his trail and had started shooting. The fear of Miller was enough. By the spring of 1922, he appeared well-positioned for re-election. He was active, visible, and uncompromising. To many in Beadle County, he represented order during a time when bootlegging and lawlessness were spreading across the country. At this point, the arc of his life still pointed upward. Decorated soldier, respected officer, elected sheriff. The transformation that would define his legacy had not yet taken place, but the traits that would shape it were already visible. By the spring of 1922, Sheriff Verne Miller appeared headed toward a second term. Then the story turned. His wife, Mildred, was admitted to a hospital in Rochester, Minnesota. Miller told his deputies he was taking a short leave to visit her. He also said they would travel to Washington, D.C., where he would seek treatment for the lung damage he had suffered from poison gas during the war. It sounded reasonable, a decorated veteran seeking medical care while standing by his ill wife. Before leaving, Miller withdrew approximately $4,000 from various bank accounts. The money was tied to county property tax collections. At the time, no alarm was raised. Weeks passed without word. Deputies grew uneasy, then suspicious. A closer look at the county accounts revealed missing funds. The withdrawals could not be explained. The sheriff who had built his reputation enforcing the law was now absent, and public money was gone. For 3 months, there was no trace of him. In the 1920s, St. Paul, Minnesota, had a reputation as a refuge for criminals. There existed an understanding between certain members of law enforcement and the underworld. Bandits could cool off there, provided they did not cause trouble locally. A St. Paul hotel operator eventually contacted South Dakota authorities, asking whether they were still looking for Miller. Before making that call, he had contacted the St. Paul chief of detectives and was reportedly told Miller was no longer wanted. When Miller was taken into custody, the arresting deputy later stated that Miller's first phone call from jail was to that same chief of detectives. He was brought back to Beadle County, this time as a prisoner in the same jail he had once overseen. Friends offered to raise the $10,000 bond set for his release. Miller refused. The reason is not documented. On April 4, 1923, he entered the South Dakota State Penitentiary after pleading guilty to embezzling $2,600 in county funds. The differences between the larger withdrawn sum and the amount cited in the guilty plea remains part of the record, though the official conviction centered on the $2,600 figure. The fall was complete. In less than 2 years, Verne Miller had gone from respected sheriff to convicted felon. The uniform was gone. The badge was gone. What remained was a man with combat experience, a reputation for violence, and now a criminal record. On April 4, 1923, Verne Miller entered the South Dakota State Penitentiary as inmate rather than lawman. The fall from sheriff to prisoner was stark, yet even behind bars, he managed to secure a measure of privilege. Armed with numerous character references, including one from the state's attorney who had prosecuted him, Miller obtained a favorable assignment. He became the warden's personal chauffeur. Instead of hard labor, he spent much of his sentence driving the warden around Sioux Falls and maintaining correspondence with friends and supporters. It was an unusual level of trust for a man convicted of embezzling public funds. His sentence was 2 years. Records differ slightly on the exact date of his release, listing either September or November of 1924. But by late 1924, he was back outside prison walls on parole. For a brief period, he attempted to return to ordinary life. According to records, he worked as a farm laborer near Doland, South Dakota, earning $70 a month. It was steady but modest income. The discipline of rural labor stood in sharp contrast to the authority he once held as sheriff. Within a year, he was back in trouble. In October 1925, Miller was fined $200 for bootlegging in federal court in Sioux Falls. Prohibition had created an underground economy that attracted men willing to take risks, and Miller stepped directly into it. The fine suggests this was not a large-scale operation at that stage, but it marked a decisive turn. After paying the fine, he disappeared from South Dakota. The public record grows thinner for a time, offering only scattered glimpses of his movements. What is clear is that he did not return to legitimate law enforcement or public service. The skills he had refined in war and as sheriff were about to be redirected into a different world, one where the badge meant little and violence carried a price. By 1926, Verne Miller had fully stepped into the Prohibition underworld. The former sheriff who once smashed moonshine stills was now building his own liquor network. He partnered with Vivian Gibson, an attractive young woman from Leola, South Dakota. Together from roughly 1926 through 1929, they became leading bootleggers in the Twin Cities. Their operations were organized and profitable. Prohibition had created demand, and Miller understood both law enforcement tactics and the routes needed to avoid them. The business extended beyond Minnesota. Miller was connected to Canadian gambling interests operating out of Montreal. These ventures placed him in contact with more established organized crime figures. Among them was Louis Lepke Buchalter, one of the most powerful crime bosses on the East Coast, and later identified as a central figure in Murder, Inc. Through these relationships, Miller's network widened. Federal files later indicated that Miller carried out work for both Jewish and Italian-American organized crime groups. He was associated with Murder, Incorporated, the Purple Gang of Detroit, and the Chicago Outfit, led by Al Capone. These were not small-time operations. They were structured criminal enterprises with national reach. On February 3, 1928, Miller was indicted for his role in a Minneapolis speakeasy shootout in which 2 police officers were wounded. The charges were dropped due to lack of evidence. The dismissal did not clear his name in the court of public opinion, but it allowed him to continue operating. By the late 1920s, he had developed a reputation as a freelance gunman. Among gangsters, there was a dark joke that Miller could sign his name with a Thompson submachine gun. His marksmanship, once recognized with the Croix de Guerre on the battlefields of France, now served a different clientele. This period also coincided with reports that Miller struggled with heavy drug use and advanced syphilis, conditions said to have made him increasingly unstable. Accounts describe unpredictable bursts of violence. Whether driven by illness, ambition, or a calculated embrace of the role, his transformation was complete. He was no longer a disgraced sheriff trying to rebuild his life. He was a man operating between cities, trusted by powerful syndicates, and increasingly known not for enforcing the law, but for breaking it with precision. By the spring of 1930, Verne Miller was no longer operating on the margins of organized crime. He was in the middle of it. On May 31st, 1930, Eugene "Red" McLaughlin, the brother of a friend of Miller's, was killed. His body was found in a Chicago canal. The killing was attributed to members of the Chicago Outfit, the criminal organization led by Al Capone. McLaughlin's death carried weight in the underworld. It demanded a response. The following day, June 1st, 1930, Miller located 3 suspected participants at a resort hotel in Fox Lake, Illinois. What happened next was swift and direct. Miller gunned down the 3 men. The killings became known as the Fox Lake Massacre. At first, the attack was attributed to members of George "Bugs" Moran's North Side Gang, longtime rivals of Capone's outfit. That misdirection reflected the confusion and rivalries that defined Chicago's gang wars. Miller's involvement would become clearer over time. The Fox Lake killings marked an escalation. This was no longer bootlegging or casino management. It was targeted retribution, carried out in daylight, in a public place. The violence carried a message. Miller had moved into the role of enforcer on a larger stage. By mid-1930, he was not simply associated with powerful crime syndicates. He was taking action in conflicts between them. The line between freelance gunman and central player in organized crime was beginning to blur. By the summer of 1930, Verne Miller had expanded beyond contract killings and bootlegging. The country was deep in the Great Depression. Banks were closing. Cash was tight. For seasoned criminals, bank robbery offered immediate payoff, and Miller aligned himself with some of the most experienced men in that trade. On July 15, 1930, Miller joined Harvey Bailey, often described as the Dean of American bank robbers. along with George Machine Gun Kelly and others, in a daylight robbery of a bank in Wilmar, Minnesota. The gang escaped with approximately $70,000. It was a significant haul for the time, especially in a struggling economy. The operation demonstrated coordination and confidence. Miller was moving in circles that included nationally known outlaws. Less than a month later, on August 13, 1930, violence turned inward. A dispute erupted over what was described as a double cross connected to the Wilmar robbery proceeds. Miller shot and killed Frank Winey Coleman, Mike Rusick, and Jew Sammy Stein. Their bodies were dumped at White Bear Lake. The killings did not appear to fracture his standing within the gang. In this world, disputes were often settled with gunfire, and survival depended on reputation. The robberies continued. On September 9, 1930, Miller again teamed with Bailey and other associates to rob a bank in Ottumwa, Iowa. The take was approximately $40,000. The pattern was emerging: strike quickly, move across state lines, stay ahead of local law enforcement. On April 8, 1931, Miller participated in another robbery, this time in Sherman, Texas. He worked alongside Harvey Bailey, Machine Gun Kelly, and Frank "Jelly" Nash. The group stole another $40,000. The geographic range of the crimes, stretching from Minnesota to Iowa to Texas, reflected the increasingly mobile nature of Depression-era bank robbers. These were not impulsive stick-ups. They involved planning, experienced gunmen, and coordinated escapes. Miller's combat training and law enforcement background made him valuable in these operations. He understood police response times, investigative methods, and the psychology of pursuit. By the end of 1931, Miller was part of a multi-state robbery network responsible for substantial losses and multiple killings. The money came fast. So did the consequences. Federal authorities were beginning to take a harder interest in criminals who crossed state lines. The era of loosely organized local manhunts was giving way to something more centralized. Verne Miller had moved from enforcing prohibition laws to profiting from their collapse. Now he was operating at a national level, and the stakes were rising with every mile. On December 16, 1932, Verne Miller again found himself at the wheel of a robbery that would leave more than an empty vault behind. That day, the Third Northwestern Bank in Minneapolis became the target. The robbery was carried out by members of the Barker Gang, a group already building a reputation for calculated violence. Miller was part of the crew and served as the getaway driver. It was a role that required precision and timing. He had experience in both. As the robbery unfolded, 2 Minneapolis police officers happened upon the scene. They were not part of a planned response. They encountered a bank heist in progress. What followed was a burst of machine gun fire. Both officers were killed. The gunfire was sudden and overwhelming. In the chaos, the gang managed to escape. The deaths of the 2 patrolmen intensified the pressure already building around Miller and his associates. Law enforcement across the Midwest was becoming increasingly coordinated, and bank robberies that ended with dead officers carried consequences that went beyond local jurisdictions. After the Minneapolis robbery, the Barker Gang split up. That was common practice after a high-profile crime. Distance created safety. Miller left Minneapolis and relocated to Kansas City, Missouri, a city with its own deep connections to organized crime and political corruption. By the end of 1932, his record included bootlegging, contract killings, multi-state bank robberies, and now the deaths of police officers in the line of duty. The pattern was escalating. The next chapter would bring him into direct confrontation with federal authority in a way that would alter American law enforcement itself. By the summer of 1933, Frank "Jelly" Nash was back in federal custody. Nash was a seasoned bank robber and longtime associate of Verne Miller. His arrest set off a chain of events that would become one of the most infamous shootouts in American criminal history. On the morning of June 17, 1933, Union Station in Kansas City, Missouri was crowded with travelers. Amid the movement of passengers and luggage, 7 lawmen escorted Nash across the parking lot toward a waiting car. The escort included FBI agents Ray Caffrey, Frank Smith, Joseph Lackey, and W.J. Vetterli, along with Kansas City detectives William Grooms and Frank Hermanson, and Oklahoma Police Chief Otto Reed. They were transporting Nash to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. The officers were alert. Nash had powerful connections in the underworld, and there was concern that someone might attempt a rescue. As Nash was being loaded into the car, 3 armed men approached. One of them, holding a Thompson submachine gun, shouted a command for the officers to hold it. In the next moments, gunfire erupted across the parking lot. Witnesses described it as sudden and overwhelming. When it ended, bodies lay scattered near the vehicle. Frank Nash was dead. FBI agent Ray Caffrey was dead. Detectives William Grooms and Frank Hermanson were dead. Oklahoma Police Chief Otto Reed was dead. Agents W.J. Vetterli and Joseph Lackey were seriously wounded but survived. The gunmen escaped. Within 2 weeks, federal investigators identified Verne Miller as the leader of the ambush. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover publicly named Charles Prettyboy Floyd and Adam Ricchetti as participants, though historians continue to debate the exact identities of all the gunmen. Controversy also remains over the motive. Some argue the attack was intended to free Nash. Others believe Nash himself was the target of a gangland execution. The historical record does not resolve the dispute. What is clear is that the result was the killing of federal and local officers in broad daylight. Attorney General Homer Cummings described the massacre as a direct challenge to the government, declaring that the army of crime had declared war on the United States. A nationwide manhunt followed. The search for Miller intensified rapidly, and the pressure extended beyond law enforcement. Members of the criminal underworld were warned that anyone harboring him could face prosecution. The Kansas City Massacre marked a turning point. The violence at Union Station did not take place in an alley or during a bank robbery. It occurred in front of witnesses, in the open against federal agents. It forced a reckoning. For Verne Miller, it ensured that the remainder of his life would be lived in flight. After the gunfire at Union Station, Verne Miller disappeared from the Midwest. The manhunt was national, and pressure came from 2 directions: federal agents on one side and the criminal syndicates on the other. In the months following the Kansas City Massacre, Miller fled east. He sought protection with Abner Longy Zwillman, a powerful New Jersey mob figure based in Orange, New Jersey. Zwillman had influence and resources, and for a time, Miller stayed under his protection. That arrangement did not last. During an argument, Miller killed one of Zwillman's gunmen. In the underworld, killing a host's associate was a dangerous act. It stripped away any remaining shield. On October 23, 1933, Miller left the East Coast and returned to Chicago. He posed as a salesman for an optical supply company while staying with his girlfriend, Vi Mathias, also known as Vivian Gibson in earlier years. Federal agents tracked him to her apartment. On the morning of November 1st, 1933, they surrounded the building. When agents moved in, gunfire broke out. Miller shot his way out of the apartment and escaped. It was another display of the marksmanship and nerve that had defined much of his adult life. Yet the circle was tightening. Law enforcement across the country was looking for him, and organized crime figures were distancing themselves. On the evening of November the 29th, 1933, a motorist traveling outside Detroit, Michigan, discovered a body in a roadside ditch. The corpse was naked and mutilated. Fingerprints confirmed it was Verne Miller. He had been severely beaten, struck 13 times with a claw hammer, and partially strangled with a clothesline. The killing bore the signs of a contract execution. Investigators believe the National Crime Syndicate was responsible. The motive was never conclusively established. Possible reasons included retaliation for the Kansas City Massacre, revenge for the Fox Lake killings, punishment for killing Zwillman's associate, or some combination of those acts. There is no definitive record naming the individuals who carried out the murder. In death, the contradictions that marked Miller's life resurfaced. Despite his criminal record and the brutality of his end, he was entitled to military honors as a World War I veteran and member of the American Legion. The national commander of the American Legion forbade the local post from participating, stating it would embarrass the organization. In White Lake, South Dakota, however, local veterans escorted his flag-draped casket. He was buried with full military honors. His hometown newspaper reported that many residents chose to remember the decorated soldier and fearless sheriff rather than the outlaw. The consequences of the Kansas City Massacre extended beyond Miller's grave. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover used the public outrage to push Congress for expanded federal law enforcement authority. Prior to the massacre, FBI agents could not carry weapons and were not empowered to make arrests. Within months, Congress passed comprehensive crime legislation granting the Bureau those powers. Verne Miller's life traced a path from decorated war hero to county sheriff, from convicted embezzler to contract killer, from bank robber to one of the most wanted men in the country. His death closed the search for a fugitive, but it also helped shape the modern powers of federal law enforcement.